Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this next session for the Kellogg's Origins project. We're going to be looking at two aspects of the technical side that we've been running with the Origins farmers. But to introduce that project, I'm going to ask Jill to set off a video for the gentleman who should have been here today chairing, but he'll explain exactly why he's not able to join us, and he'll say a few words about the Origins project, and then I'll pick up from there as we go into the session. So first part of the session is on the screen for you, and it's Duncan Rawson.
Until 7 o'clock this morning, I was planning to be here at Groundswell in person over the next couple of days delivering this presentation. But at 7 o'clock this morning, we got the COVID results back, and the little 6-year-old in this house is positive for COVID. So I now have to isolate, which is, to be honest, pretty devastating. But hopefully this recording will work. We're absolutely delighted to be at Groundswell this year. It's an event that I love. I've been to, I think, every event that there's been, and we brought our Origins farmers there as well. So for my client Kellogg's to be actually sponsoring this year and sponsoring the Source Tent is a really exciting thing that we can actually take part this year, albeit I'm not actually there in person. But I also need to give the apologies from Dave Fitzgerald as well. Dave is the head of sustainable procurement for Kellogg's Europe, and he was hoping to be here as well, be with you as well, but COVID restrictions mean that because he's based in Dublin, he's not able to fly over. So apologies from Dave as well, but I do have a recording of Dave in an interview with me earlier this week, which I can share later on. Well, my name's Duncan Rawson. I'm a partner in a consultancy business called European Food and Farming Partnerships, and we work with food businesses, helping them to reconnect back to farm and increasingly reconnect back to farm for sustainability reasons and put sustainability programs in place, etc. But today I was meant to be representing the Kellogg's Origins program, of which we'll talk about a little bit more later on. What I wanted to talk about, though, in terms of my presentation, is really the role of food businesses in the whole regenerative agriculture, the conservation agricultural space. And really, I'm going to break my presentation down into 3 parts: lost, dots, and partnerships. And I was going to start with lost, if I can just make the technology work. And it's been my recognition, if you like, or my view over the last few years particularly, that the industry has become lost. Somehow over the last few decades, we've lost our way. Now, there's a few reasons for this, which I'll touch on, but I think one of the fundamental reasons is a disconnection. And that's a disconnection between those who eat the food that we actually produce and those who actually produce it. And this disconnection has led to a lack of understanding. It's led to a lack of understanding from the public at large as to how our food is grown, but also a lack of understanding from the producers themselves as to the very nature and concerns of the consumer. What keeps Generation Y and Z awake at night is very, very different to that which keeps the boomers and Generation X awake at night. And another reason why I think we're lost, and this is a reason that sadly in my view still remains a controversial view amongst many in our industry, is that we've lost our way because we've allowed ourselves to become over-reliant on farming techniques that are simply not sustainable. Methods and methodologies that damage the very organic infrastructure that we depend on. And when I talk about organic infrastructure, I'm essentially talking about our soils. We've also, though, become lost through complexity. The supply chains that move our food from farm to supermarket shelf, they are long and they are complex. It's hard to track what comes from where. It's hard to understand what's good or bad for us. It's hard to understand how things have been produced. Worse is the plethora of audit schemes out there. I'm not even sure whether I understand what the red tractor stands for. Never mind all the other stamps that reside on our packaging. Food and drink supply chains are confusing and they lack transparency. Lastly, we're facing into lots of societal challenges, which we're all aware of. I find it amazing that society can be both malnourished and obese at the same time. We're facing into a climate change storm with little knowledge and coordination as to what agriculture's role is in this, both as the cause of, and we have to accept that agriculture is a key cause of climate change. But of course, importantly, as a mitigator of climate change issues as well. Supply chains of the future need to produce healthy and nutritious food that has been grown in an environmentally friendly and ethical way, whilst also dealing with all the significant challenges facing us, including right here and now, of course, the outcome and the outputs of Brexit. However, I do believe that there is a light shining ahead of us. It may feel as though it's a little dim at times, but I believe it is there and it can help guide us. I believe we are sitting on this precipice of a technical and environmental revolution in farming, where we can marry up regenerative farming practices, conservation agricultural practices with high-tech precision farming, whether that's precision application, precision data, etc. I think it's an incredibly exciting time for those who are prepared to think of the unthinkable and to do things differently. And I'm not just talking about farmers here, I'm talking about all those involved in do things differently. And I'm not just talking about farmers here, I'm talking about all those involved in our agri-food supply chains, from input providers all the way through to the consumer, but most importantly, including food processors and manufacturers. And that brings me to dots. We need to reconnect the dots. Supply chains can no longer be one directional. Supply chains can no longer simply be about commercial transactions with little regard for anything else. We need a multi-directional and a multifaceted approach. We need supply chains that are inclusive, that involve everyone from the consumer all the way back to the organisations that supply farmers with their inputs and, crucially, with their advice. But there's another reason why we need to join up the dots. To make this journey, we need resources. We need lots of resources. We need resources to influence and drive the change needed across the supply chains. We need resources, to put it bluntly, to pay for the changes required. And we need resources to help de-risk the changes we're asking our farmers in particular to make. Where do we find these resources? Yeah, maybe there isn't enough resources on farm to achieve this, but I think going forward, there's going to be less resources available to do so. If we look towards governments, well, our governments are full of words and promises, but I can tell you now there is not going to be anywhere near the money promised by government to subsidise our farmers in the future. If the government's looking at social care, funding the NHS, etc., or they're looking at farming, it's not rocket science to work out where government's priorities are going to be. NGOs are great at raising issues up the agenda. Might not always be the issues that we want raised up the agenda, but they're great at doing it. But they're in a constant battle to raise the funds to actually practically influence change. Our own NGOs, the NGOs that represent the agriculture sector in particular, well, I would argue that they really spend a lot of their time fighting to protect what has been, rather than fighting for what is needed in the future. To create the resources we need profits, and we need lots of profits. And that's not an easy thing to say, particularly if you're having a discussion with environmentalists as well, because there's a very strong argument to say that it's our drive for profitability that has driven us into the environmental mess that we're in today. And I can't argue against that. That is true. But if we need resources, we need profit to generate that resources. So it's about harnessing those profits in the right directions. And the good thing about agri-food supply chains is that food businesses, on a whole, make profits. Some of them make big ones. And not only that, they also have the influence within the supply chains because they buy the product to really make a difference from the consumer all the way back to the farm. They are the organisations, in my view, that have the ability to join the dots. And that brings me on to partnerships. The importance of partnerships cannot be underestimated. And I don't mean transactional partnerships, but real partnerships that are full of trust and meaning. Partnerships that create value for everyone involved within them. But even today, that still remains a rarity in my view. It's quite frustrating or quite surprising how often people talk to me about a collaboration that they're involved with or they've set up within the food chain. But when you scratch under the surface, you realise quite quickly that it's still tactical, it's still really transactional in nature. When we look at food businesses, the majority of them now have actually set themselves challenging environmental social targets to meet, and they're holding themselves to public scrutiny, whether they want it or not. But they've quickly realised that most of the issues reside not within their four walls, not within their processing plants and their factories, but back at farm. And that's something that we have to understand and we have to accept. And to that end, more and more companies are putting in some kind of farm program in place. But whilst many of these are full of good intentions, I still think a lot of them are a little more than tick box exercises. But good examples do exist. Examples that are focused on delivering value to the farmer as well as meeting the company's own goals. Examples where they have a good understanding of agriculture and the need to adopt different approaches. Approaches that build the organic infrastructure required rather than depleting it. Approaches that are practical, but also humble in origin and design. Humility when working in collaboration and partnership is so important. Approaches that help farmers and incentivize change, but without judgment. Approaches that take a long-term view. Approaches that take risks, but also de-risk the changes required. Now, there's a number of examples out there, and I'm very fortunate within my business to have worked with food companies and worked with farmers to design and implement sustainability programs, which I think have real meaning. And there's two examples that really stick out for me. One is the work that we've been doing with Nestle over the last few years on their dairy sustainability program. But the second, and the one I'm most proud of, is the work with Kellogg's Origins. Now, we started working with Kellogg's a long time ago now, 7 or 8 years ago, and we're instrumental actually in the design of the Origins program, which is now a global program, which is fantastic. And since then, I've worked across Europe and in the UK, running their programs, like I say, with the farmers. In the UK, it's a program made up of about 18 farmers in the sort of Northamptonshire area, all around the Haygates Mill. And we do all sorts of things with them. A couple of examples you're going to hear over the next couple of days. But essentially, we provide resources to help them make better decisions, make better bets, help them on this journey of regenerative agriculture. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to virtually hand over, hopefully, to Dave Fitzgerald. As I said, Dave is head of responsible sourcing for Europe for Kellogg's, and I interviewed him last week. And so hopefully what will happen now is that we'll be able to play that interview of Dave being interviewed about the Origins project. But I'm going to sort of sign off now by saying, I was going to do this after the interview with Dave, by saying that hopefully it's giving you a little bit of a taste of Origins, but more importantly, hopefully it starts to make the case that when we're in a place like we are today at Groundswell, listening to these amazing presentations, having these amazing discussions with people, that hopefully I've made a little bit of the case why it's so important that we engage the food industry, food companies in the debates, in the discussions that we're having, because I think that's the only way we get to make real tangible change across the industry and for broader society. So thank you.
Right. So that's given you a bit of an introduction to the overall Kellogg's Origins program. What I'm going to do now is look at two specific examples where Kellogg's funding has enabled us, and I'm Alastair Leake from the Game and Wildlife Conservation Trust, and my colleague here, Phil Jarvis, the same. We act as the middlemen, if you like, to help the farmers to improve what they're doing. And the two areas that we're going to focus on, firstly, Phil Jarvis is going to talk about how we improve pest management on farms, reducing our reliance on chemicals to do that. And then Clive Black is going to look at nitrogen use efficiency. The journey with Phil actually began 60 years ago when some scientists, during a trial, found that using a half dose of insecticide got better control of crop pests than using the full dose or no dose. And the reason for that was, at half dose, the beneficial insects in the field were able to survive and then eat the pests that weren't killed by the insecticide. And this got them to think about how we might improve, how we control pests going forward. Now, sadly, it took another 30 years before that manifested itself practically. Our organisation developed something called the Beetle Bank, which is fantastic at producing 1,300 beetles per square metre of bank, which go out and control your pests. Those are the ground troops. What we haven't done any work on is the paratroopers. and they're the ones which come in over the top, the spiders, the wasps, and that's an area which we feel needs to be developed. So Kellogg's have helped us with this journey. Ultimately, the idea is that we can go and be insecticide-free and rely completely on natural control. And Phil's going to introduce a new piece of work and a new publication which is going to help on that journey. Once he's finished, we'll then move on to Clive looking at nitrogen use efficiency. So, Phil, over to you.
Thank you.
Bring the paratroopers on.
Yep, thank you very much. The ecosystem engineers as well. There's some great words there, Alastair. Thank you very much. So we're going to look at a few pictures now about what's going on in the countryside and what does natural-based solution, or what do they look like? And I'm going to give you all a present as well at the end. I've got a booklet that we've just got hot off the press, which puts some of that into. So we all know what's coming around the corner because we've been told enough that biodiversity is crashing, and we've also heard that carbon is a big problem as well. So we're talking about landscape recovery and local recovery. All of this amongst climate change and 25-year environment plans while still producing food as well, and that's a key issue here as well. And how can we perhaps develop those systems, engage with them better so that we can look after both? We've heard about integrated landscape management, coming down to integrated farm management, down to integrated crop management, and we finally end up at where Alastair started at integrated pest management. And of course, the evolvement of that and what it might look like around cultural conditions, around biological, around plant protection products, is going to be an interesting issue around how we farm our systems going forward. So at the Rawson project, we're doing lots of work on soils. We're also doing a lot of work on an agroecological approach, very similar to that regenerative, building in both some of the beneficial things that we can do. If you like, it's sort of an organic fusion. Lots of habitats from wild bird covers, and what I'm going to talk about in the publication that we've got here is how they all help with our pollinators and our crop pest predators, if you like, some of those natural enemies. We're also going to talk about habitats which sometimes are included in regenerative farming, or other people will say, well, is biochar, is rock weathering, or is agroforestry really farming? But yes, it has a part to play in that holistic picture within the environment. And of course, the role of livestock, and this is a grazing trial here in the bottom picture of some sheep eating willow to try and get more cobalt, to try and get more, reduce actually some of the nitrogen content of the urine from the sheep, all adding to that holistic picture. And I mentioned food production as well. So how do we get a balance here? How do we value at the end of it? And Duncan just talked about joining the dots up. Here's some fairly major dots that need joining up in the fact that we want an environment that we care for and look after, but we also know that we have demand for food and a rising population that needs feeding. And joining those dots up so we have a win-win is really quite crucial. So one of the dots is actually a fair price for food. That would be quite good. I won't dwell on trade, but actually if you want to enhance your own environment, you probably need to give your producers who are doing it a fair run at that trade market. But we've heard about public money for public goods, and the right-hand picture there is the new agri-environment scheme at Loddington. Previously, it was around all the edges of the fields. Now it's beginning to be in the middle of the fields. So things like herbal lays, fallows, things like low-input cereals, integrating livestock into a system, integrating different cultivation systems into a system, unharvested headlands, and then a plethora of things that we've always done, which is framing our landscape with habitat which is good for biodiversity, right next to the places that are good, where that biodiversity is thriving. So round watercourses, round hedgerows, round woodlands, and trying to boost their numbers and bring them into the farm, hopefully not bringing the pests in, but if we do bring the pests in, we bring in some of those predators, some of those pollinators, some of the paratroopers that Alastair mentioned. And a lot of the work that we've based on with Kellogg's has been over a 3-year study. So in year 1, 2019, sweep netting and pitfall trapping, looking for those natural enemies. And the first one, 9,600 samples under the microscope to build a picture on just one farm in Northamptonshire. And then in year 2, 3 different farms where we're going sampling in a habitat, 10 meters into a field, 55 meters, and then 100 meters. And we're sweep netting and pitfalling all those. And last year there was 19,681 samples, all individually, and thankfully there was a team of us doing that. I did the catching and they did the counting. That's teamwork. And based on some of that work, we did some reports. So just a few graphs to give you. So Farm A is actually the Allerton project. Farm B is really a farm in the middle of the Norfolk, where its only habitat was really ditches and dikes. And actually, you'll see there the flies and aphids, but still quite a few parasitic wasps as well. And the ditch and dikes were really good for parasitic wasps. In fact, the highest numbers whatsoever. So although it could look like just a monocropped environment, in those little veins that go through there, there is some really good stuff. And then Farm C was the one in Northamptonshire, much more of a balance, some really good rich habitat. So not only did you have what we consider some crop pests, but we had a much more even distribution of those predators and paratroopers. Let's talk aphids as well. And in fact, where we talked aphid, that farm and the high blue bar there is the farm that had the most pest predators, but it also had the most aphids. But hopefully, and their yields would suggest that actually, although they were higher at the time of us sampling, there were quite a few pest predators that were dealing with them, and we naturally think of things like ladybirds, for example. But looking at some of the other pitfalls, pollen and nectar, extremely good for our beetles. And you'll see the blue is the edge of the field, and as we went into the middle of the field on this particular pollen nectar, they did decline. But that's not always the case. We tend to think that in the hedgerows and habitats there'll be lots of stuff in there. But when it comes to some of the other things, there are lots of carabid beetles actually in the fields themselves. But pollen nectar really good for those pitfalls and carabid beetles that were found in them. And this is my final graph, and then we'll go back to pictures, is the red bit is a 2019, and as you see, along the bottom there is habitat 10 meters, 55 and 100 meters. And you'll see gradually it goes down as you go into the middle of the field. And in 2020, that was sort of true as well. But the bottom blue line is the one I want to concentrate on. This is the number of carabids and insect samples we found actually in the field. So in fields that are receiving insecticides, herbicides, fungicides, a very consistent number of beetles all in the field all the way across. Scavenging, eating seeds, hopefully eating slug eggs, hopefully devouring the detritus of the natural world which falls on the floor. So when we say that a crop is a barren landscape, there are some things doing a really good job for us in the middle of the field as well. So having talked a little bit about IPM, having talked a little bit about insect studies, what are we going to do with this information now? Well, we thought it would be quite good if we put it together as a guide, very pictorial, very key, short, snappy management, very concentrated on what the benefits might be. But just before I get to that, I'd just say some of the other stuff we've been doing at Loddington around herbal lays, introducing more grass, green headlands and habitats with a number of partners. And these are the sorts of habitats that we'll be talking about in our field guide. And this is work that was done by John Holland many years ago in an HGCA, it was called then in 2008. AHDB, it's called now. What it might be called in the future will be open for discussion as well. But this is a field at Loddington, which actually with a drone flight last year actually looked very similar to what was illustrated 12 years before. And this is the sort of farming, highly productive in the middle, and of course it depends on your landscape, but there's a lot of medium and poorer land, and when I'm talking to Alastair, I always play down the classification of our land. So bringing all this together, we've come up with a natural-based solution. Jill, could you just pass me one of those copies? So I'm hoping that there's the one for everybody here. I'd like to offer you a guided tour of habitats and their management in this book that we've done in conjunction with Kellogg's, which is based on our experiences at Loddington. It's based on 2 years' worth of data from collecting nearly 30,000 samples. And really, it's a guide to introducing IPM in a very practical, very engaging way. It's also looking at things like the Origins program itself, so puts it into a snapshot, and there's 1 or 2 of our growers are in that group here today, so it's good to see you. So we're talking about cultivated margins, we're talking about agroforestry, and really we're talking about some of the management, what they look like, and what they might benefit by. So hopefully it's a very engaging way. And finally, things like hedgerow management. So that's my talk, Alastair, on natural-based solutions. Please, before you go, do come and take one of those because the box is heavy and I don't want to take it back home, and I will be distributing them throughout the showground until they're all gone. This is a first draft. You'll be one of a lucky few to get it. So please do take one away with you. Thank you very much.
My word, I hope you're not disappointed with it.
It's fantastic. Lots of colour pictures for you, Jake. Yeah, certainly. And Jake Freeston's available as well to sign it.
Thank you very much, Phil. That was tour de force. Excellent. I'm now going to move on to Clive, which is the second part of the work that we've been doing with Kellogg's. This is now focusing a bit more on the technology of growing. We noticed that Danish arable farmers are 80% nitrogen efficient, but British farmers are only 60%. And we wondered how Danish farmers were doing it. So we thought the best way to do it was to go and find out. And that's something that Kellogg's funded. We took our Origins group across to Denmark and we toured around farms and learned a huge amount. Now, I've been working with Clive for a very long time on nitrogen use efficiency from different perspectives. I've perhaps given up, whereas he's carried on. And the things that Clive is developing will prove extraordinarily useful for us to be more optimizing our usage of nitrogen. So Clive, enlighten us all to the great work you've been doing.
Fantastic. Thanks, Alastair. So what I'm going to do is talk to you today about nitrogen use efficiency and the work that we've been doing with EFFP and Kellogg's to support the growers to really concentrate on what they're doing with nitrogen and look at things in a new way. As Duncan alluded to in his video, sustainability is becoming increasingly important. When we're thinking about carbon for the future and thinking about how we grow our crops, then we've really got to think about how we do things in totally different ways. So what I'm going to do is talk to you a little bit about the Kellogg's Origin program and the work we've been doing, go through some of the background work that I've done on nitrogen use efficiency and carbon, and then describe some of the tools that we've been encouraging some growers to work with this year in terms of nitrogen use management. Then how we've been targeting and manipulating nitrogen rates and how we can challenge your thinking, and you might challenge my parentage when I give you the advice I've been giving you, as Jake will properly testify. And then just some take-home thoughts on certainly some of the things I've learnt this season. I've been doing this work for 7 years. I come from a family farming background in the Vale of York. My brother runs the farm and I just complicate it. We often are at loggerheads about what we're doing at times, but it's something that I'm very passionate about and think we need to take forward. So the Kellogg's Origins group, the aim of Kellogg's Origins is really to support farmers to be better at what they're doing, to supply better quality, sustainable food to the supply chains without damaging the farmer's pocket and introducing new techniques and technologies that help them understand that sustainability, to help them understand that profitability, and that's something that we've been working with the group this year. We've had 6 growers that have been doing trial work with me this year, and the one thing that this trial has taken is a lot of time. The investment you have to make as a farmer to improve your nitrogen use efficiency is monitoring and time to input that data. And what we've then done is use the new technologies to benchmark where we are, because if we don't know where we're starting from, then we don't honestly know where we're going to end up, and we need to know the progression we're making and making sure it's going in the right direction. We're all ingrained at university and colleges about how nitrogen is so important, and that typically the more we apply, the more yield we're going to get, and that we should be always going for the economic optimum and yield maximisation. Those days are changing. Sustainability is becoming more important. Our understanding of nitrogen is still extremely vague. There's been millions and millions of pounds invested in nitrogen research to help us make better decisions, and they always seem to come out very, very similar. And what struck me in 2014 or 15, when we were doing some auto-N trials with ADAS, we had a 6-hectare field, 15 acres, and we sampled that field on a checkerboard trial system, and we had over 100 kilos of soil variability in nitrogen. And that's on a farm where we've been practicing precision agriculture for the thick end of 20 years. We adopted the first N sensor in 1998, 99, and we've been variably applying nitrogen. I was staggered to see such levels of variability still in the soils. And one of the things I have learned is that every year is different. So what we've been looking at is, well, what struck me was, well, I think I'm very good at how I apply my nitrogen because I do it all variably. I've got technology to help me do that. I can target the rates across a field based on the plant requirements. But it struck me I didn't actually know how efficient I was. So just as a quick poll question, and for those of you that are farmers here, stick your hands up if you actually know or have measured nitrogen use efficiency on any one of your fields. And there's three that have done it with me, so I'm aware of those. You know, nitrogen use efficiency is something we really need to concentrate on. Let me give you some numbers. So, taken from Edward Downing's Frontier, an article that he wrote in the Farmers Weekly, on average, the UK nitrogen use efficiency is 60% efficient. 60% of what we put on we use, the other 36% disappears somewhere. You know, it's horrendous to think that investment is disappearing. And the investment in this isn't just a cost to us financially, it's also got implications from a carbon perspective. So what we've been trying to help growers do is benchmark their performance, benchmark your fields across the farm, to allow you the opportunity to actually measure and quantify your nitrogen use efficiency. Because as I said earlier, if you don't know where you're starting from, you don't know where you're going to go to. And we've seen colossal variances. We've had some growers that are very efficient, up to 120% use efficiency, and I'll explain that in a moment. Other growers down at 45%. You know, some huge differences in the 6 sites that we've done. And when I talk about any excess over 100% use efficiency, what that means is we're taking off all the nitrogen that we've applied to the crop, and equally we're making a withdrawal out of the nitrogen bank in the soil. So we're taking extra away than we've applied from the soil. And that has positive and negative benefits. What we're also supporting the farmers with is then a guide so they can see very visually where they are in relation to the balance of the nitrogen they're applying to where that's been removed. So the further you are into the red area on the graph, the higher the rates of nitrogen that are being left behind, the more losses you're going to have. As farmers, we're also disadvantaged. You know, one of the other things that we've done is we've benchmarked the carbon implications and limitations of that. And as farmers, when we make a decision to apply nitrogen, we do that in the rates we apply and the choice of fertiliser we use. And as farmers, there's 2 sources of big emissions that come on farm when we start applying nitrogen. One is our ability to change what we apply in the light blue. The other area is the emissions that then come with the product choice that we make. And certainly thinking about product choice of nitrogen and how that nitrogen is manufactured can have a big significant impact on your greenhouse gases. What we've done is we've mapped those so you can see the aspects of who's buying dodgy nitrogen, so to speak. You know, it could have come from a coal power station that's very energy intensive, that's burning a lot of carbon, versus other users that might be using some of the green ammonia products that are produced by renewable energies. What we also found, you know, again, big ranges. Emissions intensity from yield perspective varying between 250 to 550 kilos of CO2 per tonne, and big ranges in grain protein as well. So there's been some significant variability, and we were really surprised at how much variability there really was here. So it's all well and good knowing where we are. How do we then go about changing that? So what I started doing was thinking about the finances behind this. You know, we've got to do it for the right reasons, and that's one of the things that really appealed to Kellogg's, is that we're doing this with the farmer in mind, and we're trying to help the farmer to make more sound decisions to make more money. If we look at the numbers, if we look at John Nix, he would suggest that the average UK nitrogen or a high-end rate is about 190 kilos of N. Typically, he's suggesting that's 143 pounds. If you think of that as a 64% use efficiency, what you'll find is that you're only going to get back 91 pounds of that investment of 143 you've made. So you've got a loss of somewhere of about 52 pounds. Now, if I took any of you to the races and say, there's 140 quid, and you go and put it on a horse and you'll get 90 back, you probably wouldn't take me up on that bet. But we make that decision blindly with nitrogen every time we put the fertiliser spreader on and make a decision to apply nitrogen. And this year has been a bit of a challenge and a learning year from the soils and the temperature perspectives. So with that in mind, I was thinking, well, how can I improve my use efficiency? So I've always worked, as Alastair alluded to, with Yara for a long time. 98 we started with the N sensor and N tester. For those of you that don't know the N tester, it's a handheld spectral meter that allows you to go in the field. You can take 30 clicks of leaves, and it gives you an instant reading of how much nitrogen concentration is in the plant leaf. And what we're doing is we're asking the plant to become our nitrogen sensor. We're just measuring what's in it, and that device allows us that opportunity to measure the quantity of N in the crop. And what we can then do is then, you know, Yara have had the concept of using the N tester to determine the rates of nitrogen that you use for the second and third application, and they've always done that. We've never paid any attention to timing. And timing is absolutely critical with nitrogen. There's no point giving a load of food to something that's already got plenty because it will go to waste. And that's what we're doing with our nitrogen. So what we've been doing is taking the N tester, we've marked an area in a field, a trial area, and we've gone back to that same area every day, either minimum of a weekly interval, ideally twice a week, and we're monitoring the leaf nitrogen levels, so we then can see the amount of nitrogen within the leaf on those spots. We've also done deep nitrogen cores under there so we can see what's in the soil. So we've got a fantastic perspective of understanding what's available to the crop, what is in the crop, and how much we've given the crop to make a judgment then on is it going to be deficient in nitrogen or not. And the last thing we want to do is stress a crop. Now, when I started doing this in 2016, this was a graph of our wheat on-farm practice. So we'd made an application of 68 kilos of nitrogen for the first application, and you can see that instantly was getting picked up by the plants. As the plants were then utilising that nitrogen, you can see then we make another application and the levels go up again. Now, the challenge I have with this practice is that it had no attention at all to the dates. It had no attention to the plant demand. It was when my brother thought was the appropriate timing, as we all do. We put very little science into that. So what we found is that if we get below an N tester value, depending on your crop, somewhere between 600 and 700, in this case we were working on a value of 650, if we get below that level, you're going to stress your plant. So as you're getting down to these levels down here at 450 or so, you're in a level where the plant could well be aborting tillers. The energy that you've caused that plant to, you've made it take nitrogen up, it's grown prolifically, those tillers are going to die off. That's wasted money. And we're stressing the plants in those circumstances. So the principle of this was very much like an irrigation perspective. We have a threshold that we want to keep our nitrogen to. We make an application of fertiliser. We top it up when it's deficient. When the crops are above the line, we don't make any applications. But when they get to the borderline, we then take another application based on the spreadsheet that we're using to develop this and do this. We're recording other parameters in here, and this year we've included more, so we always recorded rainfall. This year we've also recorded soil temperature and soil moisture. We learnt last year that if we didn't know how much soil moisture there was the crop growing, was the crop going to be stressed, and could we manage that effectively? And it's been really, really interesting doing this work, and the proof of the pudding I'm sure will be at harvest, although all the growers, I think, every one, we haven't put the same amount of nitrogen on as they would have farm practice. And we've got Jake here. You're about 130 kilos of N so far this year. You know, it's quite considerable how much, how little nitrogen we put on. And we can't really see big differences between standard farm practice, where we're putting in excess of 180, 200 kilos of nitrogen, to where we are with the 120 in terms of leaf nitrogen measurements at this stage. The proof of the pudding obviously will be in the combine when we get there. Now, you'll all be wondering what the advantage of doing this is. Well, some of the things it tells you is it allows you to understand what's going on and whether that nitrogen you've applied to your crops is actually being picked up. And what we found in previous years, this was data from last year, 2020, so even in that dry April last year, with a bit of moisture in mild temperatures, you can see you're getting nitrogen uptake in your plants within 3 to 6 days of application. And that is typically what I would expect is, or historically has seen. This year screwed that right up and really turned things on its head. What we were seeing this year with nitrogen uptake, with the frost that we had in that lovely dry April, was that it was actually delaying the conversion of nitrogen into plant available forms. And it was typically taking 22 days, nearly a month, to get nitrogen in the plant. So when we're trying to make robust decisions around nitrogen timing and nitrogen uptake, this is a really instrumental tool to allow you to know whether it's taken up the nitrogen and the ability for the plant then to use that. And you can see what's going on even in dry conditions. And that was a real learning curve for me. One of the big learning curves this year has been, you know, we really need to understand our soil temperature better because it's all related to biology. Biology converts what's available in the soil through mineralisation. It also converts the fertiliser we apply to plant available sources. And as a result, if that's not working, then we aren't going to get nitrogen in the plant, and that could cause us problems. So this has been ongoing. The results that we got from when we did the first trials of this were quite staggering. I've got two different graphs on here. So the grey bars are our total farm practice in terms of nitrogen applications in kilos a hectare. And you can see the first year we did this, we applied about 190 kilos of nitrogen, 188. On the farm standard practice, we're up at 110 to 120 kilos of nitrogen. So typically what that showed us with this approach, by perhaps more timings, more regular monitoring, we could reduce our nitrogen usage by 30 kilos of N a hectare. And that in its own right has a cost saving to me in that season of £21 a hectare. The bit that I was really staggered by, and when we did this trial the first time, I hadn't expected the results that we got. My brother said, have you done the yield data? Have you processed the maps? Because I said, I was really surprised that field that you put bugger all nitrogen on, it's actually out-yielded all the other ones. So we got a 7% increase in yield for better timing and nitrogen, and we've calculated that we've actually had more nitrogen uptake, so more use efficiency from where we were at farm practice. Farm practice was 65%. With this particular field, we increased that to 83%. So significant benefit, and we've been tweaking and improving this over the years and building these tools to support the Kellogg's growers with that. And it's been a real eye-opener. So there's a real opportunity with technology to use our plants in a different way to really target the amount of nitrogen that these plants are taking up, but apply it when the plant needs it, not in a position when it's got an excess of fertiliser, when it isn't going to use it, when we're going to get huge losses that effectively are going to damage our bank balance. So my take-home message is for you to measure your use efficiency. If you don't know what it is, then work it out. We can help you do that. It's very simple to do. We'll have a platform available to do that by the end of summer. Consider using any of the technology to make the decisions. The challenge with using the technology is you need to make an investment in time. And without fail, each one of the users this year at some point has been challenged with that. Use the plant as your sensor. The plant's the thing in the ground making the decisions and working with the environment it's working in, so it's a fantastic tool to tell us what's going on. And don't forget, your biology really likes warm conditions, so we can't expect things to work if it's bloody cold and not working. So that concludes what I've got to say. Thank you, Alastair. I shall pass back to you.
Yeah, well done. Great work there. And you know, if we are going to get better at what we do, we need that kind of data coming through. Right, over to you lot, the audience. Please speak loudly. We haven't got a COVID-spreading microphone to give you to pass around amongst each other. So I have to rely on you to ask your questions loudly. So who's going first? Yes, sir.
Hi, question for Clive. You've got bread-making weeds. How would that manipulate your system? Would you be looking at foliar, urea, late in the season?
Again, so there was a lot of work done by at Rothamsted looking at critical leaf values of N. Typically, the N tester has been used as a tool by Rothamsted, and they developed some readings around that. So as long as you've got a reading above 710, 720, depending on your variety, they would suggest that you probably don't even need an application for grain protein. When you get to about that 700 level, it represents about 3.5% leaf nitrogen, and as a result, that's sufficient in the plant that will maintain your protein. So again, it's another useful tool at late timings to really support your application decisions. So you know, we're using technology to make an informed decision.
Very good. Who's next? Yes, sir.
So another question for Clive, sorry. I mean, there were big peaks and troughs there even when you were starting to monitor regularly and looking to apply more regularly. Do you see an opportunity for balancing out those peaks and troughs and just leaving it to a level that is required rather than constantly?
I mean, that's the ideal. So what we want to do is to keep it in the range we want. Obviously, the environment and the weather conditions that we operate in can be prohibitive to plant uptake. And that's what we've learned over the last 2 years with the dry periods. We've known it's been dry. That's the reason we put soil moisture probes in this year, so we could see if the plant was actually still taking water up and growing. And whether that would make us confident enough to apply nitrogen. The cold temperatures, we didn't apply it. So the reason they kept going down was the plant was trying to grow. It couldn't take any nitrogen up because the biology wasn't working. Anything we would have applied would have just sat on the surface for another month, and as a result, it did sit on the surface for a month. It's only going to increase losses. So every year is a learning year, and while we try and mitigate those peaks and troughs, we've got to try and manage that, but you've got to work with the environment and the conditions you dealt with in that particular season.
Oh.
So pick up on the uptake and the soil structure. So if you've got diversity in your cropping, but also adequate cover cropping, so everything else is good.
Yeah.
How big an impact do you think that it generally would have that you have done you talk about wheat? So the wheat is sitting in a more diverse cropping system, the uptake of cover crops and cash crops as well. If we are building that facility of structure, will that have a measure of what?
I haven't yet.
Clive, could you pray see the question so the rest of the
Sorry,
audience to hear,
so-
because there's a hand dryer going full on just out there.
So the question was related to, as we're improving the soil biology and soil fertility, is that having an impact on the nitrogen uptake? Is that right? So the concept is, that's one of the other reasons I got into this. We've gone into a Missouri drill. We're direct drilling at home. We're growing catch crops, cover crops, and we have seen at times yield reductions after cover crops. What I wanted to try and understand was, if we're in a biological transition, we don't understand properly what's going in with the soils properly yet, and how all this is coming together. It's very complex. And what we wanted to try and, or what I certainly wanted to try and do, was say, can I pick that up earlier? If I've got a big breakdown of a biomass of a cover crop that's absorbing nitrogen to break down, is that going to make my plants deficient? And do I have to make an anecdotal top-up of nitrogen at a time when the plants need it that I wasn't aware of in the past? We're still monitoring that. Every year is a learning year, and the dry weather and other conditions of there's always one biggest limiting factor, and the last 2 seasons have been dry in temperature. So we're very much learning with that. I would expect to see us learning more about that, but it's a fantastic tool to give you that information and baseline your decisions around.
Was there another question there too? Yes, please, sir.
Yeah, another one to Clive. I know the work you've done with the handheld testers, specifically involving wheat, in the talk that you've just given. I've got oats and beans growing together, and the oats appear not to need any nitrogen and haven't had any nitrogen. Can that gadget be used in other cereal crops to measure relative amounts of nitrogen, and therefore enable us as growers to make a judgment?
Yeah, so the end tester, it's just a chlorophyll meter. It doesn't understand what crop it is. All that, the understanding of that is in the science, in the apps and the things behind it that Yara have done. They do have critical values for oats and barley and other things. I've done some barley monitoring this year. I haven't done any applications on barley. We're still very much learning in other areas. That the big focus for us at the moment is in wheat. We're also looking at grass and trying to develop tools around grass and how we can improve grass use efficiency, because typically you'll have more manures going in those situations. And again, understanding what's released and when it's available is something we need to understand better to use it more effectively.
I had a demonstration on getting wheat, and it was smoothly accurate.
Yeah.
Particularly I needed the outcome. So
That's it, and that's the advantage of the end tester, really. You get an instant reading, and it's just finding what the critical values are and learning that, and that's something we can help you with. That would be easy enough to do.
Thank you. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
Yeah, a much more general question. It's very good to see a big multinational like Kellogg's helping, what do you say, 15 farmers? That's quite a few more than 15 farmers in the UK. How do we get this concept spread out to the more big multinationals to get involved, get us improving the way we farm?
That's a good question. If you can help me, I'd be really appreciative of it.
So I'm going to pass to Phil.
No, that is a good question, and I'll give the first answer, then I'll hand back to Alastair, because he has got a bigger answer there with other companies. But the first thing is to disseminate that information, show the work that they're doing, and spread the word about it, and actually, getting stuff like nitrogen use efficiency in front of other growers, promoted and supported by companies like Kellogg's, is a real good message. Alastair, there are other companies who are in this arena.
Yes. I have to say the reason that we're here today is because Kellogg's are ahead of the game on this. They began it a long time, but now all the other companies are flooding into the market. We've been working with Nestle in their milk supply chain since 2018. We're working with McDonald's and McCain's in their potato crisp supply chain. So, it's coming. It's coming.
And especially if, before I ask a question of Clive, is the work around natural-based things, it's a balanced approach to how that farming might be unveiled and how we might spread it across the landscape. But Alastair, I wouldn't mind actually if I did pick up on a question to Clive, and it's really to follow on from Paul and David's questions about what's going on in the soil and how we, and perhaps David, you're alluding to mixed cropping there and the carbon nitrogen balance. A lot of our rotations seem to have got out of balance. They have been quite carbon heavy. Now we need carbon to feed that, that's the food source. But how do we get more balance in there? Because if we do get that balance, that gives you that extra nitrogen to deal into.
Yeah, that's got to come with our learning around better farm management and probably integrated rotations and trying to incorporate and feed the soil. It's something we've forgotten about.
And perhaps agri-environment can
Absolutely.
help us in that area.
Yeah.
And I've got apologies. The second one is, although I will turn it off in a minute, is that you talked about numerous applications of nitrogen. At what stage does the cost of going out in the field, the extra time, catch up with the benefit from applying the nitrogen little and often?
It's a mathematical equation based on the price and cost at the time.
So there must be a limit. If you were talking about going 6 or 7 times rather than 3, you would then find.
Yeah, we've never been. The most we've ever done is 4 applications, and one of those was was unmanaged by my brother. He went and just did it because he didn't think he could grow a crop with 130 kilos of N.
Well, I'm going to put the last question to Phil because he's got away quite lightly. Phil, you'll know that many years ago when we wanted to know how to feed farmland birds better in the wintertime, we went out and we watched to see which birds fed off which types of seeds, and out of that came the wildlife seed mixes which feed the birds through the winters. To what extent have we been able to develop pollen and nectar mixes that help to encourage the parasites and the predators that we want to encourage to become the paratroops I talked about, to fly into the crops and to eat your pests so that you don't ever have to spray with an insecticide ever again?
Yeah, thanks very much, Alastair. One of Alastair's questions. I think obviously with some of the wild bird seed mixes, it's been quite easy to see what benefits you get out of feeding birds in the winter. The pollen and nectar or bees and seeds mixes can do both as well, so you'll get stuff that's good for pollinators and good for birds. I think specifically the answer to your question is looking at the composition of the flowers we put in our margins, or rather than just having a grass margin, and rather than just saying, well, I put some flowers, what flowers? Did it suit your soil type? For example, things like umbellifers. Now, I admit there are some crop situations where umbellifers around your farm, if you're growing carrots and parsnips, might not be a good idea. But generally around the rest of the landscape, things that encourage hoverflies, soldier beetles, and umbellifers of, things like yarrow, things like wild parsnip, angelica, whole host things. That's what we should really be concentrating on, because they will have a higher preponderance of your paratroopers, my natural pest enemies.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Phil, and thank you, everybody. But before we finish, we're going to actually finish up from the sustainability manager from Kellogg's Europe, who is just going to say a few words to you from the Kellogg's perspective.
And just remember, this, before you go, please take this. It's so hot off the press, the ink is not yet dry.
Tried to go and do the next best thing. So would you like to... Well, Dave, it's a real shame due to the pandemic, etc., that you can't get across to the UK. So we've tried to go and do the next best thing. So would you like to just start by explaining who you are and what your role is? Sure,
thanks, Duncan. So I'm Dave Fitzgerald. I lead responsible sourcing for Kellogg's in Europe. So it involves working with our ingredient and packaging suppliers to ensure that the raw materials and packaging materials that we buy are sustainably produced, particularly from an environmental and a social perspective. As part of the role, I also lead the Kellogg's Origins program in Europe, where we invest in sustainable agriculture projects. Brilliant. So, a good place to start is just to get you to describe what Kellogg's global sustainability strategy is, but then also how Origins then fits into that. Sure. So, sustainability is embedded in Kellogg's overall business strategy. Both the commercial and the sustainability strategy are embedded together and integrated. The sustainability element we call our heart and soul strategy. We have then a Better Days program where we've made commitments to deliver across a range of social and environmental areas by 2030. So that's our sort of delivery platform. So in terms of some of the commitment areas we have, particularly relevant to our supply chain and Origins, we want to reach approximately 1 million farmers and workers globally by 2030 with our sustainability programs. So that can be through on-the-ground investment in sustainable agriculture. It can be knowledge sharing with farmers in our supply network through the Origins program as well. So that's a big headline commitment for Kellogg globally. We've also committed to responsibly sourcing our top 15 priority ingredients by 2030. So this can include crops like wheat, rice, maize, and potatoes, and also some other more, say, tropical crops, for example, like palm oil and cocoa, and things like fruit and nuts as well. So how do we do that? That's through standards and certifications, things like Red Tractor. We use Red Tractor for demonstrating responsible sourcing. We have our own grower survey for certain commodities, and then we directly invest in certain projects as well within our supply chains. And then the third big commitment is around reducing our supply chain carbon emissions, so what we call our Scope 3 emissions. So we know as for many food companies, agricultural emissions are a significant part of our overall emissions in the supply chain, and through Origins we invest in research and trials to help reduce on-farm carbon emissions as well. Okay, thanks. Can you just sort of expand on that a little bit and just sort of describe some examples of the types of initiatives and projects that Origins is doing, particularly in the UK, actually, where we are today, of course? Yeah, sure. So we have a number of projects in Europe, and I'll just briefly mention a couple of the others as well. So we do work with rice growers in Spain. We work with grape growers who produce the vine, fruit, raisins and sultanas in Turkey. And we obviously work with wheat growers in the UK, which is the focus of mainly of our discussion today. But we touch on a number of key areas. So productivity obviously is important to both to the farmer and to Kellogg's as well. Looking at things like reducing input usage and costs, improving yields. So we've done a lot of work in areas like nitrogen efficiency, which is sort of ongoing in our UK project. We've done some work around fertilizer management plans in our project in Spain. So we look at ways of optimizing inputs and obviously helping improve yields as well. On the climate change side, we look at two key areas. So one is reducing carbon emissions, and the other is then improving climate resilience. So for example, a couple of things we've done there are we've run some water management trials in rice growing in Spain that demonstrated potential for up to 45% carbon emissions reduction from rice growing there. In our UK project, we did a piece of work last year looking at a net zero assessment on one of the Origin wheat farms. And that identified opportunities potentially to reduce carbon emissions, I think up to 60%. So, there's a lot of opportunity out there in that area, and we're focused on those, helping farmers understand those a little bit better as well.
Yeah. We're here at Groundswell today. Well, I'm here, you're remote. I mean, what does it mean for Kellogg's to actually sponsor an event such as Groundswell?
I'm delighted to be able to sponsor and support Groundswell. I think supporting regenerative agricultural practices, that's what our Origins program is all about. And, in the UK, Groundswell is the place to be, in terms of learning about what others are doing in this space and sharing some of what we're doing as well. I suppose all in the spirit of supporting and promoting more sustainable ways to produce food. My big regret, obviously, is I can't be there in person due to COVID restrictions, but hopefully at some time in the future I will be able to attend.
Yeah. Well, I hope that too, potentially next year. I mean, lastly, Dave, what's next for Kellogg's and sustainable agriculture? Where do you take it next?
Yeah, I think a key challenge for Kellogg's and many others in this space is how we can work together to support change and improvements at scale. Collaboration is a buzzword that's in the industry at the moment. It's an area that we're looking to see how we can work with others, and there are challenges and lots of opportunities there potentially as well. I think another aspect is how we tell the story to our customers and consumers about how their food is produced. So transparency and sustainability are very important to consumers, and we know that from some consumer insight work that we've done within our own business. So I think one of the things we're trying to do is move away from this binary narrative that large-scale conventional agriculture is detrimental to the environment and the best alternative is organic. I think while there's certainly a place for organic, there's also a place for more sustainable regenerative agricultural approaches, and we need to be able to tell the story of the good work that's already happening on farms and ensure we're challenging ourselves as to how we can improve further as well, because consumers are demanding it.
Brilliant. We'll draw a line there, I think, Dave. Like you say, it would be really great next year if we can be here again and you can be here in person. And I will look forward to telling you how it's all gone today. Many thanks.
Thanks, Duncan, and best of luck for the rest of the day and for the event. As I say, I look forward to hopefully getting there next year.